I knew something had completely shattered my family the moment I sat alone outside the intensive care unit, while my wife lay motionless behind the glass doors. My phone buzzed, not from a doctor, but a live notification. On the screen, my son was smiling by a swimming pool. My daughter raised a glass of wine. My daughter-in-law stood between them, guiding their poses, as if nothing had happened, while I was counting every breath my wife took. My children chose to celebrate. Before I go on, if you've made it this far in this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Stay with me a little longer, because what happened next completely changed the way I see family responsibility and silence. I turned off the screen and sat there for a long time, completely still. The hallway outside the intensive care unit had no windows. The white lights made everything look flat, cold. I realized I had been standing there for who knows how long. My legs were getting tired, but my mind felt empty. When a nurse walked past, I nodded out of reflex. No one asked what I needed. Maybe because in a place like this, everyone needs the same thing: time, and time never seems to be on our side. Just an hour earlier, Eleanor had been sitting in the kitchen complaining that I forgot to buy bread. Then everything collapsed too fast. A sudden dizziness, a hard, dull sound, and a silence that lasted far too long. I called emergency services with a calm voice that surprised even me. When the ambulance arrived, I followed them to St. Jude Hospital, under the burning summer heat of Phoenix. I thought I was used to emergencies. I used to be an engineer. I handled problems that could bring down entire systems, but no blueprint ever prepared me for this moment. The doctor said many things, choosing his words carefully. I only heard part of it. The rest was blocked by a single thought. I needed my children. I picked up my phone and called Brandon first. It rang 3 times. He answered, sounding rushed. He said he was at the airport, a trip that couldn't be delayed. He promised to update me later. I didn't ask anything else. I called Chloe. She said she was somewhere with weak signal, working with an important client. She apologized quickly, like she had practiced it before. I listened and ended the call. I stood up, took a few steps, then sat back down. I thought about Tiffany. I called my daughter-in-law because I believed that at that moment at least one person would say the right thing. She answered immediately. Her voice was clear, professional, not a trace of hesitation. She said Brandon had already informed her. She said she was tied up with a major case. She said she would handle the flowers and the necessary arrangements on behalf of both of them. Then she suggested I sign a few insurance documents to take care of the rest efficiently. Her wording was precise. Too precise. For a moment that required human presence, I ended the call and noticed my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something harder to name. I didn't argue. I didn't agree either. I just sat there, staring at the glass doors where Eleanor lay in a world I couldn't enter. After a while, I opened Eleanor's iPad. I meant to look for our family doctor's contact. A new notification appeared on the screen. I didn't need to open it to know what it was, but I did anyway. Not out of curiosity, but because I needed to know where I stood in this family. The image had no hospital sounds. It had sunlight, blue water, laughter. I recognized my son's face, then my daughter's, then my daughter-in-law's. I didn't watch for long, just long enough to understand that their priorities were already very clear. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I only felt something open up inside me, a hollow space. I used to think indifference was temporary, that it came from pressure, from youth. But here a line had been crossed. No one asked how Eleanor was doing. No one asked if I was okay. There were promises to come back, to make it up later, but all of them were spoken from far away. A young nurse approached me. His name was Marcus. He spoke softly, explaining Eleanor's condition in short, simple sentences. He didn't promise anything. He just said they were doing everything they could. I nodded. For the first time that day, someone looked directly at me while speaking. When Marcus left, I returned to my seat. I thought about the years Eleanor and I spent building everything together. The long trips, the late nights, the times we chose to save so our children could have more. I thought about the family dinners Eleanor always tried to keep complete, and I thought about the present. A woman lying still behind a glass door, a man sitting outside, and 3 young people living their lives, as if nothing had broken. Slowly I understood something. My children's absence wasn't just a lack of responsibility. It was a choice, and that choice told me more than any apology ever could. In that moment, I knew I couldn't keep waiting, not to punish anyone, but to protect Eleanor from the cold silence of the people who should have been here. The next morning I left the hospital earlier than usual, not because I wanted to go, but because there was something I had to do before coming back to sit in front of that glass door again. I barely slept last night, not because I was afraid of the worst, but because I realized something even more serious. If I didn't act immediately, Eleanor wouldn't just lose her peace. Everything she and I had built together could be pulled right out of our hands. David Chen's law office was in a low building far from downtown. I had met him a few times over the years, mostly to review paperwork. When I walked in, he looked at me for a long moment before asking me to sit. Maybe he saw something different on my face. I didn't circle around the issue. I told him directly that I wanted to change my will, not revise it, completely change it. I asked to temporarily remove Brandon and Chloe from all inheritance rights, and I made one thing very clear. Tiffany was not to have any role, direct or indirect. Attorney Chen didn't react right away. He asked if I was sure. I nodded. I told him I had waited long enough to see who would show up when the family needed them most. He didn't ask anything else. He opened the files and began reviewing each section. When he reached the emergency accounts, he stopped. He said there was a transaction in process, not yet completed. $300,000. The request came from Brandon. The reason listed was contingency expenses. I looked at that amount, and it felt unfamiliar. No one had asked me. No one had informed me. Before I could react, Attorney Chen continued. He said there was another document, a legal draft, very carefully prepared. The name on it was Tiffany's, listed as family representative. The content outlined transferring management control of our largest resort to Brandon if Eleanor were to become incapable of decision-making. The effective timing was clearly specified. There was no signature from me, but every clause was ready to be activated. I didn't speak for a few seconds, not because I was shocked, but because I needed to piece together the fragments in my mind. The cold phone call, the suggestion that I sign documents, the calculated absence. Everything suddenly fell into place. I realized I wasn't just facing indifference. I was standing in front of a plan, prepared in advance, waiting for the weakest moment to move. Attorney Chen asked if I wanted to stop the transaction. I said yes, immediately. I asked to freeze all related accounts. I requested that ownership of the resorts be restructured into a new protective framework. And then I said something that made him look up. I wanted all medical decision-making authority removed from my children, completely. He asked if I had thought this through. I told him I had thought about it too much. For many years. Only now did I understand the cost of trusting the wrong people. I signed each page with a steady hand. No shaking. No hesitation. Each signature was a door closing. Quietly, but firmly. When I left the office, the Phoenix sun poured down onto the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, not to rest, but to breathe. I didn't feel relieved. I just felt that I was doing what needed to be done. Not out of anger, but out of protection. Back at the hospital, I took my usual seat. Marcus was changing shifts. He nodded at me. I asked about Eleanor's condition. He answered in an even voice without avoiding my eyes. No new updates. I thanked him and returned to my chair. I looked at the glass door and thought about the documents I had just signed. I didn't know what Eleanor would think if she knew, but I believed she would understand. Eleanor always believed family was meant to be a safe place, and if that place was no longer safe, then it had to be rebuilt on different foundations. That afternoon I received an email. The sender was Tiffany. The subject line carried no concern. It was a legal notice. The language was formal, cold. She accused me of misusing shared assets, of causing emotional harm to Brandon. She demanded that I disclose the recent changes and revoke the new medical authority. She wrote as if I were a difficult client, not her husband's father. I read every word. Didn't skip a single line. Then I replied. Just one sentence. No explanation. No defense. I wrote that everything had been legally transferred, and if clarification was needed, it could be handled in a more appropriate setting. I hit send and put the phone down. For the first time since Eleanor was brought here, I no longer felt passive. I knew the storm was coming. I knew there would be confrontations, but I also knew I had stopped waiting for kindness from people who had chosen another path. I looked back at Eleanor through the glass. I whispered, very softly, that I was doing this for her, not to keep money, but to protect the meaning of the life we built together. And in that moment I understood something clearly. The real battle was only beginning, not in the hospital, but within my own family. After sending that email, I didn't feel like I had won or lost. I only felt a brief pause, the kind that comes right before everything gets louder. I had touched something Tiffany never wanted anyone to touch: control. And I knew that from that moment on, every move I made would be watched. I returned to the waiting area like always. Marcus was standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts. When he saw me, he walked over and asked quietly if I needed anything. The way he asked didn't feel like a duty. It felt like a habit, from someone used to standing in fragile moments. I asked about Eleanor, not looking for good news, just the truth. He answered slowly, clearly, without avoiding anything. No signs of improvement, but nothing worse either. I nodded. At this point, honesty was the rarest thing. I looked around the intensive care unit. Some families stood together, speaking in whispers. Others sat alone like me. I realized something simple. Not everyone who shares blood is willing to stay when things get hard. And not everyone without blood ties is an outsider. That thought stayed with me all morning. Around midday, I called Attorney Chen. I told him I wanted to finalize the medical power of attorney. He asked who I had chosen. I didn't answer right away. I looked through the glass and saw Marcus adjusting the equipment beside Eleanor, careful as if she were his own family. Then I answered. That afternoon, David Chen came to the hospital. We sat in a small room near the hallway. Marcus was invited in. He looked uncomfortable when he heard the request. He said he was just a nurse, not used to making big decisions. I told him I didn't need someone to decide for me. I needed someone with nothing to gain, someone who could say no if that was what was best for Eleanor. Marcus stayed silent for a long time. Then he nodded, not with excitement, but with responsibility. We signed the documents right there. No ceremony, no grand promises, just signatures placed in a quiet room. When it was done, I felt a little lighter, not because I had handed over authority, but because I knew it was finally in the right place. I returned to my chair. The glass door was still there. Eleanor was still lying motionless. But I no longer felt like I was standing on sinking ground. The calm didn't last. My phone kept vibrating for hours afterward. I didn't answer. I knew who was calling. I knew why they were calling. I chose silence. Not to run away, but to keep my breathing from being pulled into meaningless arguments. By evening, Marcus returned and said Eleanor's condition was stable, in the most fragile way possible. I thanked him. He added that since I signed the papers, there had been a few inquiries from outside. He didn't name names. I didn't need to ask. We looked at each other and understood. Things were shifting. That night, I sat alone, longer than usual. I thought about Brandon as a child holding my hand while we crossed parking lots. I thought about Chloe sitting for hours with Eleanor choosing paint colors for their first home. I didn't think about Tiffany with anger. I thought of her as someone who chose a different path, one where everything is calculated in advance. I didn't comfort myself by believing they would come to understand. I had gone too far to return to those hopes. I understood that when power is taken away, those who are used to using it will react, and that reaction won't be gentle. Near midnight, I received a short message from an unknown number. Just one question, asking who now held medical decision-making authority. I didn't reply. I placed the phone face down. I looked at Eleanor and told myself that from now on, no decision would be pulled toward other interests. Even if that made me a target, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a husband doing the last part of the job he still could, protecting his wife's peace, even if it meant facing resistance from the very people he once trusted the most. When I stood up to leave, I knew one thing clearly. Giving Marcus that authority wasn't just a medical decision, it was a statement, and the people on the other side had heard it, loud and clear. The next morning I walked into the hospital with a familiar feeling, but no sense of peace. Something in the hallway had changed. Eyes lingered longer. A nurse whispered something to the person beside her as I passed. I knew the silence I had chosen the night before was no longer working. It had been broken. Marcus met me as soon as I sat down. He spoke quietly, said 3 people were waiting at the front desk. He didn't need to say their names. I already knew. I nodded and told him to keep doing his job. I didn't stand up right away. I looked through the glass at Eleanor, lying there motionless, and I told myself that whatever confrontation came today was not allowed to touch her peace. Footsteps approached before I had time to rise. Brandon appeared first. His face was tight, stripped of its usual confidence. Chloe followed, sunglasses, still resting on her head, even though we were indoors. Tiffany came last. Her steps were steady, her eyes cold and focused. She looked straight at me. No greeting, no concern. Tiffany spoke first. She said I had crossed a line. She said I was tearing the family apart with irrational decisions. She emphasized my age, mentioned stress, and used words that sounded caring, but were really an accusation. Brandon stood beside her, nodding. Chloe stayed silent, but her eyes showed irritation at being dragged into something that wasn't in her plans. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to be fast. I've spent my life solving complicated problems by moving slowly. I asked them one simple question. During all the days Eleanor has been lying here, who has sat with her for more than 10 minutes? No one answered. Tiffany pressed her lips together. Brandon looked away. Chloe sighed. Tiffany shifted tactics. She started talking about the law, about rights, about what she called financial responsibility. She spoke as if Eleanor were just a clause in a contract. I listened, didn't interrupt. When she paused to breathe, I took a folder from my bag. I didn't hand it to Brandon. I placed it directly in front of Tiffany. They were copies of what she had prepared. Every page, every clause. I didn't need to explain. Tiffany's face changed for a brief moment. Not panic, but recognition that the plan had been exposed. Brandon looked down at the papers, then at me, uncertainty in his eyes. Chloe lowered her head, avoiding the details. I spoke slowly, one sentence at a time. I said I was no longer arguing. I said what they were seeing now was the result of choices already made. I said Eleanor was not an opportunity. She was a person. And anyone who saw her condition as a doorway into our assets no longer had the right to stand near her. Tiffany scoffed. She said I was being offensive. She said I would face consequences. I looked directly at her and said the consequences began the moment she chose to use her knowledge to cross an ethical line. I told her she wasn't my daughter, but she had become the reason I no longer trusted my son's judgment. Brandon stepped forward, his voice rising. He said I was destroying his future. I asked him where he was when his mother was brought here. He fell silent. Chloe finally spoke, said I was making everything worse. I asked her if the poolside photos that night had helped Eleanor in any way. She turned away. I took a deep breath. I said one last thing. I said the Eleanor Harrison Foundation had been established. I said the assets had been transferred to serve those in need of healing, not those looking to take advantage of a moment of weakness. I didn't mention numbers. I didn't need to. I just said that door was closed. Tiffany stepped closer, her voice lower, more dangerous. I didn't let her finish. I turned to the security guard nearby and said these 3 individuals were causing a disturbance and affecting patient peace. I asked that they be escorted out. No shouting. No anger. Security moved in. Brandon reacted, first shocked and furious. Chloe removed her sunglasses, staring at me, as if she no longer recognized the man in front of her. Tiffany stayed silent for a few final seconds, then said this wasn't over. I nodded. I said I didn't expect it to end quickly. When they were led out of the hallway, the space grew quiet again. I sat back down in my old chair. My hands trembled slightly, but my breathing stayed steady. Marcus stood at a distance watching me, not asking anything. I signaled that it was over. I looked back at Eleanor through the glass. The confrontation hadn't brought any sense of victory. It only confirmed a truth I had already accepted. Some relationships can't be saved by patience. They can only end with clear boundaries, and I had drawn that boundary, right here in the place where I once hoped my family would come back together. After that day, the hospital slowly returned to its usual rhythm. No more hurried footsteps behind me. No more tense eyes waiting for another confrontation. Just the steady sound of machines, and the scorching Phoenix mornings passing beyond a small window. I returned to my familiar chair, sitting beside the glass door, as if I had never left. A few days passed in a long, quiet stretch. I began to get used to it. I read the paper. I revised the old notes. Sometimes I just sat and looked at Eleanor. I talked to her. Not much. I told her small things. That the tree in the garden needed more water. That the old diner was still open. I didn't know if she could hear me. But I believed presence still mattered, even without an answer. One morning, Marcus asked me to come over. His voice wasn't rushed. Not overly hopeful either. He said Eleanor was responding. Not clearly, not strongly, but differently than before. I stood there for a long time before stepping in. I had learned not to chase fragile signs. This time I walked in with a different kind of care. I held Eleanor's hand. It was warm, and for the first time in days, her fingers curled slightly around mine. Eleanor woke not long after. There was no miracle moment, no first words, just her eyes opening, looking at me, then up at the ceiling. The doctors explained her condition clearly. The damage had left its mark. She couldn't speak. Movement was very limited. I listened. I nodded. I didn't ask when things would go back to normal. I already understood that normal was no longer an option. I moved Eleanor to a quieter recovery room. I was there every day. I learned how to help her practice the smallest movements. I learned how to read her eyes, her breathing, the slightest changes. It wasn't easy, but it was clear. Every bit of progress, no matter how small, carried its own meaning. At the same time, another kind of work began. The Eleanor Harrison Foundation officially started operating. There was no launch event, no cameras, no speeches. I worked only with the people who needed to be there. 2 smaller resorts were gradually converted. Nothing luxurious, nothing showy, just enough to become places of recovery for people like Eleanor. Families who couldn't afford expensive care, but still needed a decent place to begin again. After some time, Marcus left the ICU. He accepted the role of medical lead at the new center. Not for the title, but because he understood what I was trying to build. We worked together, slowly. Every decision was weighed carefully. There was no room for haste or personal gain. I didn't hear anything more from Brandon, Chloe, or Tiffany, and I didn't go looking. Some distances, once created for protection, don't need to be closed. I didn't hold resentment. I simply no longer made room for them in important decisions. My life grew smaller. I didn't travel far. I didn't make big plans. My days revolved around Eleanor and the recovery center. I managed. I listened. I fixed what wasn't right. I didn't feel like I was sacrificing. I felt like I was finishing the work of a life lived together for a very long time. Some afternoons I wheeled Eleanor into the small courtyard behind the center. The Phoenix summer heat felt softer there. I read to her. Nothing grand. Just simple passages. Sometimes I paused, looked at her, then continued. She didn't respond with words, but she was calm, in a different way, and that was enough. I thought a lot about the word legacy. I used to think it was what you leave behind after you're gone. Now I understand it's what you choose to protect when everything is being tested. Eleanor didn't leave me a number. She left me a direction. One evening, when the center was quiet, I sat beside Eleanor and looked at the small camera on the table. I spoke slowly, like always. I said there were people who tried to take what we had, but they couldn't take the reason we had it. I said peace doesn't come from holding on tightly, but from placing things where they belong. I don't know what the future holds. Eleanor will never be who she was before. Neither will my family. But I don't feel defeated. I chose not to let greed decide our final days. I chose to build something quieter, but stronger. When I turned off the lights and wheeled Eleanor into her room, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And at this age, that's enough for me. If you stayed with me until the very end, thank you for listening to my story. If it made you reflect, or reminded you to cherish the people beside you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with anyone who might need to hear it. Your support helps stories like this continue to be told. Thank you for your time.